we're going to talk about this horrible economic crisis that has been caused by this pandemic, right? And so we're going to bring in an expert, a friend of the show. He's a political scientist and a professor of international political economy at Brown University. He contributes to several podcasts and also the author of his new book, expected out by June 2020. It's called Angrynomics. Please welcome back to the show, Mark Blyth. Mark, thank you for coming on.
Nice to be back, Jimmy.
So let me I went to your Twitter feed, and it's got lots of great information on it. And I just want to real briefly, just give me a minute to go over this article you tweeted out. It's called The Normal Economy is Never Coming Back. And in it, there's some really interesting stuff. It says, in sectors like retail, which has recently come under fierce pressure from online competition, the temporary lockdown may prove to be terminal. Okay. In many cases, the stores that shut down in early March will not reopen. The jobs will be permanently lost. Millions of Americans and their families are facing catastrophe. So this is the kind of thing I've been talking about here at the show, and people don't realize because they go to their other progressive news shows and they're talking about this stimulus vote as if it's just another bad vote. And it's not a catastrophe like we've never seen before, that swaths of the economy are going to be permanently gone. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to raise everyone's consciousness here about this. The economic fallout from these immense human dramas defies calculation. Okay, so I wasn't being hyperbolic last week and the week before when I was telling you what's happening. The collapse is not the result of a financial crisis. It is not even the direct result of the pandemic. The collapse is the result of a deliberate policy choice, which is itself a radical novelty. So let me bring in Mark now to talk about this with us. So can you, wherever you want to start or finish, or do you want to comment on that first, or what do you tell me?
Yeah, okay, so that piece is up in foreignpolicy.com. Everyone should go have a look at it or get it off my Twitter feed, which is MK Blyth. That's Adam Tooze. He's a very smart historian at Columbia, great blogger, and he just put this one together and said, okay, let's think about this. We've never had a situation whereby 70% of the economy has gone into the deep freeze. It's just a shutdown. Now, what happens to all of the different component parts of the economy when you do this, right? So here's a simple way to think about this. I've been trying to work on a good analogy for this. Different economies are a bit like different cars. Bear with me on this one. If you're in Northern Europe, you're driving a Volvo. It's got a fair bit of power. It's pretty safe. It's a bit boring. It's got lots of airbags. If you crash in that thing, there's a chance you'll walk away because of the safety equipment. America's kind of like a 1968 Mustang GT that's got an extra supercharger on it. It goes flying down the highway at 140, and if you crash, everything goes terminal because there's no airbags, there's no safeties, there's nothing there that's a shock absorber. The whole thing is contingent on everybody working all the time. Now, before we even start talking about all the inequalities and inequities and everything that's been baked into the cake, right? Just think about this. You've got 330 million Americans. My favorite statistic, 270 million handguns. That's just the handguns, okay? 80 million people work hourly. None of them have any kind of statutory sick pay or can leave their jobs because they're sick or any of this sort of stuff that you get in other countries, right? And before we went into this crisis, you had 27 million people with absolutely no medical coverage. Now, remember that everybody's medical coverage is dependent on their employer, and those employers are shutting down because all of their customers are at home. So you've got this catastrophic series of incidents coming together, and each one compounds the other. What Adam's talking about there is the deliberate policy choice. Is this wasn't something that, in a sense, came out of the blue like the financial crisis last time or even the pandemic. This is what happens when you take an economy that's like the United States that goes very fast with no airbags, with no redundancies, right? And you basically tell it to stop. Bits come wearing off. And it's not clear that 3 months from now or whenever it is that we finally get some kind of normality back, you go back to the malls.
So is money going to mean anything in 4 or 5 months? And can you predict what America will look like by the end of the summer?
So what Adam did in that piece was to say, okay, let's think this through. It's not just like we all went on a long vacation and came back 2 weeks later. Take the example of retail. Imagine that you get a world in which you've got a second wave of infection. We've killed it, but we still don't have the testing capacity. There's not everything we know about the virus. Are you going to go shop until you literally drop? Right? Are you going to go back to a place where there's a chance that you can become sick? So, of course, we're not going to go straight back into whatever it's going to be. It's going to be a bit of a slog, to say the least. Every economy is facing this now. How do we get back to work? Who do we send back to work? And it's all contingent on knowledge about data, about testing, about who's got antibodies, who's been infected, etc. None of which we're in a position to really tell the truth about yet because we simply don't know. We don't have the experience. To go to your first question, is money going to be worth anything? Yeah, of course it is. Because at the end of the day, you're still going to have to eat. You're still going to have to shop. You're still going to have to find groceries. And so long as we can secure those type of supply chains from farms to tables, from factories and food factories across the United States into the cities, then you'll survive this. It's not that type of crisis that I worry about. It's more, as Adam is saying, what you expect to happen, like you get back to travel, right? Well, the airlines have been given a huge bailout, which I think is ridiculous. But at the end of the day, you're really going to be wanting to sit on a can that's flying at 30,000 feet in the air with 200 other people again when we haven't licked this virus yet? Probably not. So it's just not clear that like we're going to switch on the switch and we'll all go back to work. That's not probably what's not going to happen. We need to start thinking about that.
So let's talk about the surge in public debt, because that's what people can't, they don't have income. So they can't pay their rent, they can't pay their mortgage. Now we're getting this piecemeal mortgage deferment, which is nothing. Because what I found out in California is that they're going to give you 3 months of not paying your mortgage, but on that fourth month you have to pay the fourth month mortgage plus the previous 3, which is not really that's not really a break. They're not giving you a break. So do you foresee again people getting kicked out of their houses, a foreclosure crisis like we had after the last economic fall?
Well, if it is, it's more likely to be renters this time around, because one of the consequences of the crisis last time was that the number of homeowners dropped and the number of renters increased. What also happened was a lot of big private money, things like private equity funds, started to invest in basically rental accommodation. Then you've got the whole notion of those commercial businesses that survive on rent checks coming in, and they've all borrowed money in order to buy the buildings and do all the things that they do. So there's this whole chain of obligations, which starts with the renter and goes to the landlord, which goes to the company, etc. And we see this through commercial real estate. Just today, I can't remember who it was now, Boots the chemist, very big chemist in the United Kingdom, has said that they're not paying rent on their properties. Well, the people who invested in the holding company that built the building or whatever, they're now going to lose that revenue too. So there's all these interconnections that we take for granted, because so long as everybody's working and everything's going and there's money flowing, great. But if you start to sequester 70% of the economy, bits fall off. That's basically what happens. So on the mortgage side, yeah, I could imagine within 2 to 3 months, forget forbearance, as you're saying. That's just basically you're going to pay me interest and you're going to pay it all in the fourth month. What you're going to see is most of those mortgages are still going into the same types of collateralized obligations, those derivative bond structures that we had last time. And then people buy tranches of those bonds. And guess what's going to happen? The value of those bonds are going to go down because people aren't paying their mortgages. But I think this time we're going to see more of an immediate crunch in the rental sector. And the problem is, for both, with so many people without income, it's not as if you're throwing out 1 or 2 people out of their houses, right? Where's everybody going to go?
Right.
I mean, this is a housing crisis in the making.
So here's my yes, we all understand. So a landlord has a debt, right? Because he owns that building. He borrowed from the bank. And so he takes his rent money and he pays his mortgage note. So now nobody has rent money. So now that landlord has to kick out his renters and get new people in who have money. Problem is nobody has any money, right?
That's the problem this time around. This isn't like 2% or 5% of the market. You're talking 30% of the market, or perhaps even bigger. There just isn't another person to come in and take it. So what you get in these situations, and what we're going to have to face up with on the public side and on the private side, is some form of generalized debt forgiveness. It just gets written off, it just gets written down, and everybody agrees to move on because there's nowhere to go to squeeze to get the money back. It just ain't going to be there.
Yeah, you can't. It's the old saying, you can't squeeze blood out of a turnip, right? That's if the people literally don't have the money, they're not spending it on vacations or flat screen TVs. There is no money. So
there is no money.
So
exactly.
what they're doing in like Denmark, right? Aren't they guaranteeing like 80 the cash payments directly to the worker, which for some reason in America we've decided to make it as hard as possible to give direct cash payments to each worker in person. Can you talk a little bit about the differences and how we're handling it?
Yeah, I mean, basically, if you were to say how are we handling it, it's a bit like trying to give yourself brain surgery with a mallet, a hammer, and hoping for the best. That's pretty much where we are just now. What the Brits have done, even the Conservatives in Britain, are the same as the Danes. They looked at this and said, look, is this a crisis of parts aren't getting to factories? No. Is this a crisis of everybody's like really dying of this virus? No, but we have to be careful because we'll overwhelm the health system, right? So what do you have to do? You have to put everybody in their houses. You have to shut down commerce. Then the only thing you do is support consumption. And the best way to do that is to use the existing structure of wages. And you basically say to the employers, keep paying these people. And then you say to the banks that back the employers, we've got your back. And then you feed the public money into the banking system to wages. That's what they're doing. Will people be missed out? Is it? Yes. Will it hurt the self-employed? Yes. But it's definitely the way to do it. Now, we could have done this. There's a thing in the United States called Treasury Direct. You can literally go to treasurydirect.gov and open up an account with the Federal Reserve. Most people don't know this, right? And it's usually used for buying savings bonds and stuff like that. But there's absolutely no reason the Fed couldn't reverse that and basically just put money in your Treasury Direct account, and then you could transfer that to your bank account. So, right, I know. So we've decided to do checks, right? We've decided literally to do checks. Who does checks in the 21st century? I mean, for God's sake, the whole country's got these. This is totally bonkers.
So, okay. So let's let me back it up just a bit and unpack what you just said. So in places like Denmark
and
Britain, so instead of them sending you a check, what they do is the business owners already have bank accounts, and so the government just credits their bank accounts with cash, and then they just keep paying their workers. That's what's happening in Denmark and the UK. That's what's happening?
Yep. Yes.
And so why don't they do that here in the United States?
Well, it does look suspiciously like this enables the Republicans to play a classic bait and switch, which is the following. You have this hard-fought negotiation where they want to bail out business because basically they're all invested in these businesses. The Democrats, God love them, God loathe them, they actually care slightly more about people, and they actually want to bail out the people this time. And they realize, like the Brits do, that this is a crisis of consumption. You need to give direct support to people's ability to feed themselves and their families. So they eventually get both. Everybody wins. Funny, though, that what happens then is Trump comes along and fires the people who are meant to do the oversight on this. Funny that like all the cash that's going to go to these airlines and cruise lines and other really strategically important industries, I bet they're not waiting on a check. I bet that went straight into their bank accounts. Meanwhile, Joe Schmo has to sit around and wait for a check. Well, that just basically allows you to kind of like not really do that bit and sort of, hope that you can grab all this public cash, shower your friends with it, and then, hopefully we're out of there before anyone notices. The only problem is the virus isn't going to play ball to your timetable. So you're just hurting people and you're making this worse.
And so when this first happened, Dylan Ratigan was on the show and he said that they're going to have to do some form of a UBI and some form of Medicare for all. And I said, yeah, but that goes against, the establishment's every theory and everything they've ever done. Why would they do it now? And he said it's because they're out of options. And it seems like you're kind of saying the same thing, that we have to give money to people to put in their pocket, which is kind of like what FDR did instead of supply side economics, which is what we did again, right? Which is what the stimulus bill was give all the money to the richest corporations and people in the country and screw everybody else. And we already know that doesn't work. So they're already starting to talk in D.C. that we have to do a fourth stimulus bill. And now the Democrats are really going to fight this time to make sure you get health care and wages in a pandemic. You would think that the Democratic leadership, which took over the House, in the pandemic would first make sure the healthcare part was taken care of. It's a pandemic. But no, the first thing they did was make sure the richest people in the country got their bank accounts filled. And now the workers have nothing. So do you think they will do a UBI? Because that seems to be the only thing that can save this, right?
Well, it depends what you mean by a UBI. I mean, the Brits and the Danes aren't doing UBI. What they're basically saying is, we're going to be in lockdown for 3 months, perhaps longer. In that limited period, we will basically not give a damn about deficits or debts, and we're going to fill everybody's pockets to the tune of 80%. That's not universal. First of all, it's just wage earners, right? Secondly, it's not as a benefit. It is a backfill on wages, right? So it's not a UBI in that sense. So let's be clear, right?
Okay.
Are we going to get a UBI in the United States? No, because you're not going to get a UBI in most places on that definition. What you're getting is direct support for wages, which the theory is we'll get back to work and then we can move on. In terms of, the healthcare situation, yeah, absolutely. But the problem is, let's start at the beginning. Truman tried to do it, failed. Let's see, Kennedy tried to do it, failed. Clinton tried to do it, failed. Obama got some version of it through, and they're trying to destroy it. It's incredibly hard to get universal healthcare in an economy of 300 million people done in a fortnight, particularly when all of the vested interests are against it. So what you do is you start basically on wage, and then you hope you can move on. So I think if they'd spent all of their capital and all of their time trying to do universal healthcare right now, you would be in an even worse situation. You wouldn't have any wages going anywhere. You would have still had the bailouts to the top, and we wouldn't be any further forward.
So in America, when people lose their job, they lose their health insurance, which means they lose access to health care. Yep. So with predicted 30% unemployment, which is probably going to be even higher, that means
it's a total disaster. No other country has managed to build a vulnerability like this into their society. It's insane. Everybody else has figured out that if you're not paying, well, I'll give you my numbers, right? So I pay about, for my family, $1,000 a month just out of my paycheck prior to taxes, right? My employer sticks more on it. And then on top of that, I've got a $6,000 deductible before my health insurance actually kicks in, right? So take $20,000, right? And then the equivalent in taxes, I would need to pay $20,000. I need to be earning $60,000 more, right? This is insanity. You could basically do what everybody else does and spend about 9% of GDP rather than 18% of GDP, one central payer system, and I'd save a fortune because I wouldn't need to spend $1,000 a month and a $6,000 deductible. Whatever I was paying in taxes would be half of that. Same on the employer side. It literally makes no sense to me why the United States doesn't do this. The payoff to employers if you had central funded taxes, right? Every time you hire someone, the wage has to go up by a third to cover benefits. Imagine you could just say to all employers, hey, how do you like to save a third in your entire wage bill? Why doesn't everybody think this is a good idea? I literally don't get it. And now in the middle of a pandemic, this is the worst system you could possibly imagine.
Because for some reason it takes courage to say what you just said in our political environment, and the only people willing to make that say what you just said don't do it in such a good way. They don't really have the gift of gab. They don't have much charisma, and they always bend the knee to the establishment. So. And it's because that they have a stranglehold on our politicians, big pharma, and the health insurance industry. There's only really 4 sectors that fund politics, right? The banks, military-industrial complex, big pharma, health insurance, and the oil and the fossil fuel. So that's it. So that's why we can't. It's because of the way we do our government in the United States, and because we don't live in a democracy. People think because they get to vote, they live in a democracy. We live in a rapacious oligarchy, and now we're seeing this is exactly what happens in a rapacious oligarchy. Not only during a pandemic do they not give you health care or direct cash payments that you desperately need, they snap into action and take care of Wall Street and the richest people in the country, and then they leave town for 3 weeks. And guess what? Even your progressive leaders who don't take the corporate money, they voted for it anyway. So what is the point of voting for people who don't take corporate money if they bend to the knee to the people who do anyway? The answer is there is no point. What do you think the answer? Do you have any answer? I know you're not this isn't your expertise, but what are some of political answers to the places we found? I mean, it seems like our government is so calcified and so captured by corporations that it's even unable to move in a moment like this.
Well, part of it is the partisan division. The Republicans are going to back business. The Democrats back business, but also to a certain extent back normal people. And if you just tried to force through a stimulus package that was just for normal people, it would never get through Congress because the Republicans control it. It's as simple as that. You're going to have to give them what they want to get some of what you want. And that's been Democratic politics for 2 generations. Is it good enough? No. But sadly, you got to deal with we've got to deal with the facts that if you look at opinion polls, you'll find that about 15 to 20% of people have left progressive politics written into their answers. And a large part of the country, the Atlanta burbs, Baltimore, Northern California, just ain't like that. And the South certainly isn't as well in large part. So going it alone with those set of policies, it's just very hard to get anything done. And that's why it's always a politics of compromise. I don't like it much either, but unfortunately, that's the way the country is.
So I'll just say this. I would like to think the Democrats care about working people. In fact, that is a myth. And Barack Obama was George Bush 2.0. And that's why we got Donald Trump, because people were even more desperate after 8 years of lefty politics from Barack Obama, who one time slipped in an interview that he was doing with a foreign news agency and said that his policies would actually be considered moderate Republican if this was 1980s. So we all know that Barack Obama was actually Republican. Nancy Pelosi was the one who stopped direct cash payments and wanted to put a means test on the Republican idea of direct cash payments during this pandemic. Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer were the ones just as responsible for this bill and screwing. And then after it was revealed that the people got screwed in this bill, Nancy Pelosi's fix was to go lower the taxes for people who make over $250,000. I mean, that's just the way the gears work. There's one party in this country, and it's a money party. Now, I don't know economics like you do, but I certainly know politics, and there ain't two parties in this country.
So here's something that might be a light at the end of the tunnel on this one, at least as far as healthcare goes. So let's think about Texas. Texas has 18% of the population has no healthcare, and that's before everyone starts losing their jobs, right? Now, those emergency rooms are just going to be complete shit shows, right? And already in places like Boston and New York, these hospitals are spending money hand over fist. They're not going to get that back from the insurance companies. At the end of the day, the government's going to pay. So at the end of the day, if the government's paying, why not just make the government the payer? Because if your insurance companies actually can't insure, what the hell is the point in giving them the money in the first place?
There is no point. In fact, so Trump has proposed so far, this is the proposal, that the government, if you get sick with coronavirus, the government will pay for your testing and your treatment. And the stipulation is that they will give that money through the Medicare pipeline to the hospital, but they are not allowed to bill you extra. And so there's no co-payments, there's no nothing, there's no billing on the back end. You get taken care of. The government gives them a direct payment. That sounds like how it should work.
Yeah, it sounds like government healthcare.
Yeah. So, by the way, that was so the Democrats aren't even proposing that. That's Trump outlefting the Democrats, which shows you how calcified the Democratic Party is, because they serve Wall Street, the military-industrial complex, big pharma, and healthcare, just like anybody.
And big tech. Don't forget big tech.
And that's right. And that's big. Where does Nancy Pelosi come from? She comes from Silicon Valley. So that's exactly right.
So here's an interesting one for you. But what else comes out of Silicon Valley? Loads of arguments for UBI. Why do Silicon Valley types like this so much? Because if you can convince everybody that they're going to be redundant in a few years anyway, because they're much smarter than their machines are much smarter, you begin to internalize that and accept it. And then it becomes much easier to actually replace you with a robot.
So what's your theory? What are your feeling on UBI in general and the replacement of robot? I mean, I think this is all Andrew Yang's big idea that trucks are going to go to driverless and we're going to lose all these workers. And my whole point is that you guys the driverless cars and trucks are solving a problem that does not exist.
Exactly, and not just that. Here's the problem: it's not technology, it's law. So when you write an algorithm that tells the car, bus of orphans, bus of nuns, always hit the bus of nuns before the orphans. The minute you write that down, your liability just goes through the roof. Because you've basically said, I've got a programmed instruction in my car on who to kill first, right? There's no way around that, right? So this is all hawking bullshit and talking about bits of the sky and selling each other bits of the sky, which is what Silicon Valley does. And unfortunately, part of that then infects a conversation about what we really need to have a conversation is how the hell do we get higher wages for people in the United States who work, which is not UBI and is not anything else like that.
How do we do that?
It's a very good question. One of the ways that you do it is you actually get people to pay taxes. There's a very simple one. You could just pay some taxes. Consider this one. You don't need to go back to Eisenhower's level of 91%. Let's just go back to the 1980s. If you went back to the 1980s level of taxes, you would be able to redistribute equivalent to about 2 to 3% of GDP right through the wage structure. Right? That make a huge difference in people's lives right there. Imagine you got corporations to actually pay taxes, because basically they don't pay any if they're any good at this. Apple hasn't paid taxes in years, right? These big tech firms specialize in this stuff. There's a great work by an economist called Gabriel Zuckman. He's got a book called The Hidden Wealth of Nations that goes into this. It's all about taxes and tax havens. If you manage to get your hands on that and then basically use that for healthcare, etc., for public goods that basically that work as kind of subsidies to wages, right? You don't have to spend this money on health insurance because it's being paid for another way. Just basically taxing would be a really good idea, but we don't do that. We just cut taxes on people and then scream about deficits.
So I don't. So do you? I don't see austerity coming. You're famous. Your book about austerity and the damages that austerity does. Do you think that there will be austerity after this? I don't. What do you say?
Well, here's my line on that is the following. If you're in Europe and you think about the Italian economy hasn't grown in 20 years. They've been absolutely pummeled by this virus. The shutdown for them takes an unemployment rate that was already in double figures and is going to push it to 30% or more. If you do austerity then, if you say right now you have to run a budget surplus and increase taxes on the poor and cut the health service, you might as well roll out the fascist uniforms now, right? Because that's the reaction you're going to get. So I would hope that people aren't stupid enough to try this. But let's look no further than Wisconsin. Because what did you have there as well as an epic exercise in voter suppression using the virus as a tool? What were they also demanding? Well, given the fact that all the schools are shut, we might as well cut the schools budget. So they'll be back. Right? When we'll wake up and we'll suddenly find we've got 100%, 170% of debt to GDP, and they'll all start freaking out again. Now, the fact that the interest rate is basically negative on United States borrowing over 10 years, the interest rates are not going anywhere, then basically the rate of growth in the economy will always be higher than the rate of interest on the bond. So it shrinks just by itself so long as you keep growing. What are they going to do? A whole ton of cuts so that they don't have to pay any taxes, because that's all this is ever about. And then to hell with the economy because, hey, I'm invested in finance and tech. I don't give a shit.
Well, that's depressing.
Thank you. But the thing is, will they get away with it, right? I mean, ultimately, there's an upside to everything that's happened here. No, the upside is the following. Once you've done all this stuff, once you've basically proven that the Federal Reserve can find $2 trillion down the back of the sofa for whatever reason it wants, right? Once you've shown that you can do direct support for wages, you don't have to fart around with quantitative easing or any of this fancy nonsense, right? Once you've shown that there really is a magic money tree, and it's a very, very big one, then a lot of the things that we were arguing about, we take healthcare as one of them, but student debt is another one, right? If the Federal Reserve can manage to magic up $1.5 trillion to support the T-bill market in 24 hours, it can take $1.5 trillion, buy all those loans and put them on their balance sheet and forget about them.
So what Jill Stein was saying was actually true. You can do quantitative easing for student debt.
Well, it's not even, you don't even have to call it that. I mean, basically, what the Fed does is buy assets from the market, right? Yeah. And then swaps them for cash, right? So if these loans are assets, then they can just buy them, put them there, call it something like the Millennial Insurance in the Future Fund, and give it an acronym, and then just forget about it over time, and basically some way that it'll be made to disappear in the way that lots of mortgages and other things are already on the Fed's balance sheet.
So it sounds to me, again, that's why I have you here. So correct me if I'm wrong. This sounds to me like modern monetary theory, where because we have our sovereign currency, we can print as much money as we want to solve all of our problems. And now this crisis is actually proving that to be true. Can you comment?
I think that's pretty much exactly the case. What we've done is we've said we're not really doing MMT because we're still doing it through the bond market. And the reason we're doing it through the bond market is because it's an established channel, and because we don't actually have the channels to get money out to real people. Part of the problem here is the Fed is really good at giving money to businesses and banks because that's what the Fed does, right? And Treasury is really good at doing one or two things, but that's all they do. So what we're actually doing is we're basically increasing a lot of bond financing. We're buying a lot of assets. We're putting a lot of cash out into the system, through the banking system, etc. So it's not really MMT, but what we are showing is that deficits don't matter and debts don't matter, and not just in moments of crises. Right? That's what's really pushing the envelope here. If the folks watching are interested, look up a piece by a guy called Olivier Blanchard, Blanchard. Came out at the end of last year. He's the ex-chief economist of the IMF, and he wrote this piece basically saying, long-term debt, it doesn't really matter because interest rates are so low, and over 5 decades, the rate of growth in the economy has been higher than the rate of growth in the debt on 4 out of 5. So to be obsessed with debts and deficits literally makes no sense. So why don't we just chill out about it? That's the ex-head of the IMF. So you don't need to go MMT, right? The mainstream basically thinks this now.
So do you think we really are past this argument then? Because it's as recent as March 17th, or 15th, there was a debate, and Joe Biden turned to Bernie Sanders, who was proposing Medicare for all, and said, how are you going to pay for it? Where are you going to get the money from?
Yeah, I think that argument basically now you can just turn around and go, well, didn't we just find money for cruise lines? I mean, just keep saying that over and over again. You managed to find money for cruise lines. This is healthcare. Go away and don't insult me.
Hey, this is the part where I tell you where our live shows are, but there aren't any. And then I would tell you to go join our premium, but nobody has a fucking job. So why don't you just enjoy the video?